Hi everyone, welcome to What Does the Bible Teach with Pastor Joshua Olivares. I'm Jamie, and in today's episode, we will be finishing off our discussion of Matthew chapter 24 with What does the parable of the fig tree mean? And why is the hour and time of his coming not revealed in verse 36? Also, why does Jesus compare his coming to the days of Noah and the flood? And lastly, what lesson does the parable of the faithful and evil servant teach us? So, Pastor Josh, what does the Bible teach?
Thank you, Jamie. The Bible teaches us here in Matthew chapter 24, starting at verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Now this lesson from the parable teaches us that the common observation of the twigs getting tender before summer is an indication that it is almost time for harvest. And when the word harvest is used metaphorically in the Bible, it can refer to soul winning. And according to Matthew chapter 9, starting at verse 36, the Bible teaches us, seeing the people, he felt compassion for them, because they were distressed and dispirited, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. We also see in the book of John, chapter 4, starting at verse 34, Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Now, the word harvest could also be used when speaking about judgment. In Matthew chapter 13, starting at verse 24, the Bible teaches us, Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, for while you are gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then in Revelation chapter 14, starting at verse 15, the Bible teaches us, And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. And another angel came out the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, Put in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth, and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So the point is, as the twigs of the fig tree become tender, indicating the nearness of summer, likewise, when you see the judgments of God pulsating simultaneously, then behold, that the return of Christ is near. Now, continuing on in Matthew 24, starting at verse 33, the Bible teaches us, "So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door." Now, in this passage, Christ is relating his coming, his arrival, his parousia, to the parable of the fig tree seen in verse 32. And as the fig tree becomes tender when summer is near, likewise, Christ is saying in verse 33, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Now, what are all these things that Christ speaks of? Well, the context in this chapter seems to imply that it is a clear and obvious reference to the birth pangs of verses 4 to 14, followed by the abomination of desolation in verse 15, then the fleeing and hardships and deceptions that are seen in verses 16 to 26. So when Christ says, when all these things happen, know that I am at the door. Now, the phrase "at the door" speaks of nearness or closeness. Here in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, starting at verse 20, the Bible teaches us, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me." Now, continuing on in Matthew 24, the Bible teaches us here in verses 34, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Now, we have learned, beloved, that when Christ says all these things, it is a clear reference to the signs in verses 4 down to verse 28, which is going to precede the very coming and arrival of the Lord Jesus Christ. But when he says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place," the generation that Christ speaks of here are to those that are going to experience and live in the future great tribulation. And when Christ says in verse 35, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away," this teaches us, as God's words always fulfills its purpose, likewise, the predictions of Christ concerning the tribulation and his second coming will also be fulfilled. And we know this to be the case because in Isaiah chapter 55, starting at verse 11, the Bible teaches us, "So will my word be, which goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it." Then in Matthew chapter 23, starting at verse 38, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And lastly, here in Matthew chapter 5, starting at verse 18, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished." So the parable of the fig tree is an illustration that Christ uses to display his return, his coming, his parousia. Like as how the fig tree becomes tender when summer is near, likewise, the return of Christ is imminent. The return of Christ is near. When all these things, all these signs mentioned in verses 4 to 28 simultaneously occur, then know that he is near, even at the door. And as we continue more tomorrow morning, if you have any questions concerning about today's episode or questions about the Bible in general, kindly let us know, and we will do what we can to answer your questions on this podcast, What Does the Bible Teach? This is Pastor Joshua Olivares, just wanting to gladly remind you that Jesus Christ is God.